Most people think of the Spartans as the ultimate warriors. We picture 300 men with bronze shields, crimson cloaks, and spears, holding the line at Thermopylae against impossible odds. Wars you'll read about in every high school history book, a culture where men were bred for battle, trained from childhood to know no fear, and willing to die for glory. But what the movies and your history teachers leave out is the real reason the Spartans could spend their entire lives preparing for war. If you think their dominance was just about discipline and bravery, you're wrong. The legendary power of Sparta wasn't just built on sweat and muscle. It was built on one of the most ruthless, rigid, and terrifying economic systems in human history. And once you look behind the myth of the warrior, you realize the Spartans weren't just fighting the Persians. They were fighting a desperate, invisible war at home, every single day. To understand Sparta, you have to understand a simple economic reality: time is money. In every other ancient Greek city-state, citizens had to work. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and sailors. If Athens went to war, the guy holding the shield next to you was a baker. But the Spartans, they didn't bake, they didn't build, they didn't farm. They outsourced their entire economy to a subjugated, enslaved class of people called the Helots. The Helots were the absolute economic engine of Sparta. They were serfs tied to the land, forced to harvest the crops in hand over half of everything they produced just to feed the military elite. There were no Spartan farmers because every single Spartan male was a full-time, state-sponsored soldier. But this ultimate freedom came at a terrifying cost. By the time of the 300, the Helot workforce outnumbered the Spartan citizens by an estimated 7-1. Imagine living in a society where you are entirely surrounded by an enslaved workforce that outnumbers you, hates you, and produces absolutely everything you need to survive. The Spartans were terrified. They knew their entire way of life balanced on a knife's edge. If the Helot economic engine stopped, Sparta collapsed. So they didn't just rule through laws, they ruled through systematic, economic, and psychological terror. Every autumn, the Spartan government officially declared war on its own workforce. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a legal loophole used by a secret police force called the Crypteia. It allowed young Spartans to hunt down and murder any Helot who looked too strong, too smart, or too capable of leading a rebellion, all without committing a religious crime. They weaponized fear to protect their supply chain. But their economic extremism didn't stop with the Helots. Sparta also waged war on wealth itself. While Athens was getting rich trading silver coins across the Mediterranean, Sparta's legendary lawgiver, Lycurgus, instituted a radical financial policy. He banned gold and silver money. Instead, Sparta used heavy, unwieldy iron bars as currency. According to ancient historians, when the iron was red hot, it was quenched in vinegar to make the metal brittle, rendering it entirely useless for forging weapons or tools. Why? Because they wanted to destroy the desire for wealth. An iron bar had so little value, you would need a horse and cart just to carry enough money to buy a decent piece of property. It was impossible to hide, impossible to hoard, and foreign merchants absolutely refused to accept it. By making their money practically worthless, Sparta intentionally isolated its economy from the rest of the world. No luxury goods came in, no Spartan could get rich and challenge the military state. Everyone remained equally dependent on the system. It was the ancient world's ultimate form of capital control. On the surface, it sounded like a perfect, incorruptible society. In reality, it was an economic pressure cooker. Because their financial system was completely closed off, and their reliance on Helot labor so absolute, Sparta could never innovate. While the rest of Greece was experiencing an explosion of art, science, trade, and philosophy, Sparta remained a rigid, militarized camp. They were so obsessed with maintaining control over their economic base that they couldn't adapt to a changing world. And the thing about rigid systems is that they rarely bend, they just break. The real fall of Sparta didn't happen in a glorious last stand against a massive foreign empire. It happened because their economic foundation crumbled. In 464 BC, a massive earthquake struck the region. The Helots, seeing their masters weakened, launched a devastating revolt. It took the Spartans years to crush the uprising, and the cracks in the foundation never truly healed. Decades later, at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the city-state of Thebes finally shattered the invincible Spartan army on the battlefield. But the Thebans didn't just kill Spartans, they did something much more devastating. They marched into Spartan territory and liberated the Helots. Overnight, Sparta's economic engine was gone. Without the Helots to farm the land, the Spartans couldn't feed themselves, let alone maintain a full-time professional army. The fearsome Spartan military machine wasn't defeated by better tactics alone, it went bankrupt. If you think this is just history, think again. Today, we are living through our own versions of this fragile design. The story of Sparta is a cautionary tale about the dangers of a one-dimensional economy. Today, we see nations and global corporations that rely on similarly rigid systems, extracting wealth from a massive, underpaid base while pouring all their resources into a single, aggressive strategy. We see economies built on debt and fear, isolated from true innovation, terrified that the foundation they stand on will suddenly give way. The tools have changed. Instead of Helots, we have exploited labor markets, fragile supply chains, and absolute reliance on foreign manufacturing. Instead of iron bars, we have manipulated currencies and trade wars. But the underlying truth remains the same: a system that relies entirely on suppressing its foundation to project power at the top is always living on borrowed time. The legacy of the 300 Spartans is one of incredible bravery, yes, but it is also a masterclass in economic fragility. They built a society perfectly designed for war, but entirely incapable of growth. They were so afraid of losing their status that they locked themselves in a financial and social prison of their own making. The same policies meant to make them invincible ultimately guaranteed their irrelevance. That is the hidden cost of the Spartan system. It was fought on a battlefield where the deadliest enemy wasn't an empire across the sea, but the captive workforce in their own fields and the rigid laws in their own books. History tells us that economies built entirely on control rarely have clean endings. They tend to spiral until the foundation shatters. Will the economies of today that rely on extreme wealth concentration and systemic exploitation hold their position? Will societies that sacrifice innovation for the illusion of total security survive the next major global shock? These aren't just abstract questions for historians. They determine the stability of our global markets, the value of your labor, and the true cost of the goods you consume every single day. The most dangerous thing about the Spartan economy was that it looked unbreakable right up until the exact moment it shattered. When an army loses a battle, they can retreat and rebuild. When an entire economic foundation is ripped away, the society simply ceases to exist. By the time the Spartans realized their system was completely unsustainable, the damage was done. That's why understanding financial history is so critical. If you understand the patterns, the way rigid control stifles growth, the way exploiting a foundation eventually collapses the roof, you can see the cracks in modern systems long before the earthquake hits. You can diversify your own skills, ensure your wealth isn't tied up in a single fragile institution, and avoid falling for the illusion that pure aggression is the same thing as security. In the end, the financial truth of the 300 Spartans is a reminder that strength is not just about holding a shield wall. It is about adaptability, sustainable growth, and the true cost of your resources. The victors in the long run are not always the most heavily armed. Often they are simply the most resilient, and the losers are those who never realized their foundation was rotting until the ground gave way. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the themes are familiar. The helot system in Sparta, the closed economies of the Cold War, the fragile global supply chains of today. The names and faces change, the playbook stays the same. So the next time you hear a story about absolute military might or ruthless efficiency, don't just think of the glory on the surface. Think of this hidden economic engine running underneath. And remember, in a war for survival, a fragile economy is the deadliest weapon your enemy can exploit. Understanding this is the first step to building true resilience. The second is making sure your own foundation is built on rock, not the backs of others. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The past left a trail. I'll show you where it leads.